Could a sitting Republican senator fail to make the runoff in his own party's primary? That's the stunning question being asked in Texas and across the political world in one of the most closely watched races this cycle. Joining me to discuss, Geoffrey Skelley, Chief Elections Analyst at Decision Desk HQ. Hey, Geoffrey, so the conventional wisdom on this race is that we were heading to a runoff between sitting incumbent Senator John Cornyn and Texas Attorney General Ken Paxton, but Representative Wesley Hunt creeping into second place. What are you seeing in these latest polls that is leading many to question what's going to happen in this March 3rd primary?
Hey there. Well, thanks for having me. Yeah, John Cornyn, the longtime incumbent senator seeking re-election in Texas and has been locked in a sort of knockdown, drag-out fight, mainly with Ken Paxton, the state attorney general, for many months now, starting well back in 2025 when Paxton announced that he was going to run against Cornyn. And then Wesley Hunt, a congressman from Texas, got into the race. And basically, Hunt's been hanging around in third. However, in some recent polling, there have been at least a couple times where Hunt has been running about even with Cornyn or even slightly above Cornyn in the primary polls. And that's important because in Texas, if no candidate gets a majority in that primary, then you have a runoff between the top two candidates. Well, if Cornyn were to finish third, you'd have a situation where it's Paxton and Hunt advancing to a runoff rather than Cornyn, which would be obviously a pretty notable fall for an incumbent senator seeking re-election. I mean, there's a chance he's going to lose renomination one way or the other, but if he doesn't even make the primary runoff, that'd obviously be a big deal.
Yeah, especially considering how much money is being dumped into the race on Cornyn's behalf. How unusual would it be for a sitting senator not to make a runoff election in their own party's primary?
It would be very unusual, at least to be clear, there have been instances where where a Republican senator or a Democratic senator has lost renomination in a primary or a convention over the years. However, the last time you had a senator running in a state that had primary runoffs fail to make a runoff when in a situation where no one got a majority in that initial vote is actually all the way back in 1944 when Hattie Caraway, who was the first woman elected to the Senate in her own right, ended up losing her bid for a third term, essentially, and finished fourth, actually, in a Democratic primary there. So a very different time and a very long time ago. So it's been a while since that's happened. To be clear, again, we've had senators lose renomination since. You can look at an appointed senator like Luther Strange lost in 2017. And there have been other recent cases. I think probably the one that looms in terms of someone not getting to sort of the next round of the nomination process, but it was a little different, was actually Bob Bennett in Utah in 2010 during the Tea Party year, where you had a number of Republican incumbents lose renomination. Bob Bennett, the incumbent senator from Utah, he did not qualify for the primary out of the party convention, which was the system that Utah used at the time. And so he didn't make the primary in the end that occurred there. So in that sense, he didn't make the runoff in a sense, but not quite the same system that we're talking about here.
You write that John Cornyn could be in trouble even if he does eke out a small temporary possibly victory by making it into this primary, making it past the primary into the runoff. Why do you write that?
Absolutely. Well, if you take a look at our polling average for the Texas primary from Decision Desk HQ, we have Paxton polling at around 30%. We have Cornyn here at about 25%, and you have Hunt at about 20%. And I think it just comes down to the fact that if you have an incumbent, so this is somebody who has previously won nomination by winning over mostly Republican voters in a primary. Texas does have open primaries, so people who there's not party registration, so someone in theory can vote who's not a Republican. But most of the people voting in a Republican primary are Republicans or lean that way. So the fact that Cornyn is only attracting about a quarter of the voters in that, from that primary electorate, I think bodes poorly for him, even in a head-to-head contest. And if you look at a lot of the head-to-head polling where Cornyn is matched against, say, Paxton in a potential runoff, Paxton is usually leading. And really the only polls that have shown Cornyn doing better than Paxton are the ones coming from people who've been spending on Cornyn's behalf in this primary. And they've been spending gobs and gobs. I mean, more than $50 million in advertising trying to shore up Cornyn's position without much evidence that it's worked. Paxton's position has weakened as they've attacked him, but Cornyn has not necessarily gained in his stead, and I think that's also telling.
Cornyn could probably really use an endorsement from President Trump. So far, though, no signs that he plans on weighing in ahead of this initial round of voting. Want to stay in Texas and talk about the Democratic side because it's super interesting over there as well. State Representative James Tallarico and Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, the two top candidates in that race. It's turned a bit ugly over the past several weeks, race becoming an issue in that contest. What do you make of where we're at on the Democratic side of the Texas Senate race?
Right. So we don't have quite as much polling in this race yet than we do for the other one. To be clear, Crockett did not officially enter this race until right before the filing deadline in December. So we've only really known for sure that we had this Crockett Tallarico matchup for not even about 2 months, I guess, all told at this point. So there hasn't been quite as much survey data, which is why Decision Desk does not have a polling average out yet. However, there have been surveys of the race. The most recent one is from the University of Houston's Hobby School in partnership with YouGov, and it found Jasmine Crockett ahead, 47% to 39% over James Tallarico. And that, I think that's good news for Crockett. This is a pollster with a long track record of polling Texas. But at the same time, it does show we're below 50%. And I do think one of the little wrinkles in here to keep in mind is there is a very minor third candidate on the ballot in this race. And again, Texas is a state where you have to have a majority in the primary to win a nomination. And Ahmad Hassan is in the race. He's this third candidate. He will not get much of the vote. But if he does get a couple percent of the vote and Tallarico and Crockett run very, very, very close, 48, 49%, you could actually have a runoff in this race as well. Though the runoff, to be clear, looks much more likely to happen on the Republican side than the Democratic side. However, again, we should never just take one poll as gospel. Another recent survey here from the Texas Public Opinion Research outfit had this race with more undecideds and it much more like a tie with Crockett nominally ahead 38 to 37%. This is another January poll. And then a third one from Emerson College and Nexstar found Tallarico ahead 47-38. So basically the opposite of what the University of Houston poll had. So I think this speaks to a level of uncertainty about the race. It speaks to the fact that a lot could depend on who exactly shows up in this primary, the degree to which some voters who are not out and out Democrats choose to vote in the Democratic primary. I think some of the if you sort of look at the crosstabs in the polling, Crockett tends to do a little bit better with true Democrats, people who identify strongly with the Democratic Party. Tallarico tends to do a little bit better with voters who might identify as independent, but are thinking about voting in the primary, because again, they can do that in Texas. And so, a lot depends on who chooses to vote in that. And I think this is also potentially important in the Republican primary, because we know from polling that John Cornyn tends to do better with voters who identify as independent. But if some of them end up voting in the Democratic primary rather than the Republican primary, that actually might hurt Cornyn. Now, obviously, the voters who would be making that choice are probably very highly engaged independent voters. A lot of independent voters, by their very nature, are not as engaged. But nonetheless, if you're sort of looking for things at the margins that could matter, and especially knowing the situation in both races, that both look close and both have a few percent here and there could matter a great deal, it's something else to keep an eye on.
Interesting thing about that University of Houston poll that showed Crockett up 8 is it was actually polled before this controversy came out, where Tallarico allegedly said that one of the other candidates that was previously in the race and who ran before, Colin Allred, since dropped out of the race, Tallarico allegedly called him a mediocre black man, caused some criticism along racial lines and some back and forth among kind of the bases of the party and the supporters of each camp. Be very interesting to see a poll after that and how people kind of are processing that controversy. I just want to ask one more question about that race. There's been some hand-wringing on the Democratic side. I think the conventional wisdom is that Tallarico would be a more formidable candidate in the general election, but I think there's some hesitation and talk about whether or not senators will want to weigh in. The National Committee is standing on the sideline and not endorsing, as per It usually doesn't in a race like this. But what do you make of kind of the hand wringing going on in Democratic circles over who would be the best candidate versus not wanting to seem like they're putting the scale on one candidate who happens to be a white man?
Right. I think the evidence at this point is the jury is a little out on whether or not Tallarico would be a notably more formidable general election candidate. It is true that some polling was released by the National Republican Senatorial Committee that suggested that Tallarico had a better chance of beating Ken Paxton if Paxton were the GOP nominee than Crockett. It was, I think, if I recall correctly, Tallarico was up by 1, Crockett was down 3, or it may have been that Tallarico was up 3 and Crockett was down 1. The point is, when you're talking about margins that small, it doesn't really quite matter. The point is there was a slight difference. Now, the National Republican Senatorial Committee wants Cornyn to be the nominee because they believe Cornyn will be a better general election candidate than Ken Paxton. And they think if Cornyn loses that primary in the end, and Ken Paxton, who has had some scandals, personal and professional, that could be brought up repeatedly, and that potentially in a blue-leaning midterm cycle could make that seat more vulnerable for Republicans than it would be if Cornyn is the nominee in the general election. There's obviously a push by some Republicans in D.C. they'd like this data to show donors, oh, hey, we need to keep supporting Cornyn because he's giving us a better shot at holding on to the seat. But if you also look at some of the polling, this most recent poll from the University of Houston, you don't see a big difference in terms of the margins. Ken Paxton up 45-43 on Crockett, Paxton up 46-44 on Tallarico, Cornyn up 45-43 on Crockett, Cornyn up 44-43 on Tallarico. These are well inside the margin of error. And so I think it's really hard to say with any confidence that one of the candidates is stronger, especially this far out from the November general election. That's not to say that there couldn't end up being some marginal differences, but it's really hard to know, I think, at this point. I think both candidates, there's reason for that conventional wisdom. I think Crockett has made the case that, look, she can expand the electorate. She can turn out some people who might not ordinarily turn out in a lower turnout midterm election. And that often means voters of color, communities that have leaned Democratic historically. Maybe Trump did even a little bit better with than past Republicans in the 2024 election, but perhaps she could do stronger with them again and turn out some more marginal voters who may not have turned out in the 2024 election, who may have preferred, say, Joe Biden in 2020. Tallarico is saying, well, look, we have a Republican-leaning electorate because it's Texas. I think I can make inroads a little bit better with some of the center-right voters who may be a little turned off by the very far-right turn among some elements of the Republican Party in Texas. But so someone has to win them over at the end of the day. But all that is theory at this point, and this early polling doesn't really bear any of that out quite yet.
Yeah, that argument by Tallarico probably even stronger if Ken Paxton ends up winning the race, considering some of the controversies in his past. I want to talk about the president's approval rating. Your new average of polls shows 54% disapprove, 43% approve. How does that compare to what we've seen in the president's approval throughout his second term?
Right. So yeah, those were the numbers in our polling memo. The thing with any of these numbers is that, especially with approval polling, which is the thing we get the most of, the numbers do shift a little bit, but the broad situation is the same. Trump's approval rating is in the low 40s, about 42% now in our polling average. His disapproval rating is about 55%. So obviously very close to where it was, 54% when we released the polling memo yesterday. And that is broadly defined his position. I would say the disapproval is a little on the high side, but there's no question that his approval rating has been stuck sort of in between 40 and 45% since the fall. You saw before that time his approval rating hanging out at around 45% pretty consistently. It bounced up and down a little bit, but if you sort of look at 45% being this line across right there on our average, it was hovering a little above or a little below 45 for the most part. Then you get to the fall and the numbers start to drop in November, around the November and after the November 2025 elections, down to the low 40s. It's bumped back up since then, at least once. But for the most part, I'd say the safer thing to say is that the average has been 42, 43% in that time. And so when you look at something like approval rating, the numbers in the average can jump around a little bit day to day. But I think what's worth noting is sort of that long-term average and sort of where the long-term base has been. And there's been clearly a slight drop in Trump's approval rating in that time span over the last 2 months, where it was at about 45%, generally speaking. Now it's at 42, 43%, generally speaking. And so that would seem to suggest some actual long-term loss in approval. And so that's meaningful.
Can you pinpoint where that's coming from? Like, what demographic is it, or what issue is it that's leading to those relatively low numbers?
Well, just in terms of his approval rating, we can see an uptick in November, last fall, in his disapproval and a drop in approval among independents. Again, the crosstab numbers are are going to be a lot noisier than the overall approval numbers, because at the end of the day, you're dealing with smaller subsamples in terms of the sample size. So, one poll could show Trump's approval rating among independents at 40%, another could be 31, and it wouldn't be, and those numbers could actually both be inside the margin of error, and a similar margin of error at that, but depending on the poll. However, I do think that the general thing that we've been seeing is a rise in disapproval for Trump among independent voters, a rise in disapproval among Latino voters, a decline in his approval among men. I mean, generally speaking, we know that men are somewhat more Republican leaning, women are somewhat more Democratic leaning. But Trump has lost somewhat similar ground among both of these groups. It's just that at the end of the day, that means that women are disapproving of Trump more strongly than they did previously on net. And now Trump's approval, he was previously above water among men. Now he's actually slightly below water, underwater with men. His disapproval among men now in our crosstab average is about 50%. His approval is about 47%. So I think it's
big change from election day.
Yes, and so it's hard to point maybe to one thing that's responsible for all this, but I do think you can come back to the economy. We don't have a polling average for economic sentiment, but if you look at all the polling that's been done on economic sentiment, sort of regardless of how the question's been asked, people are frustrated about the cost of living. Trump was elected very clearly in part on the idea that he had been a good steward of the economy during his time as president. COVID-19 pandemic notwithstanding, obviously he wasn't, it's hard to blame a pandemic on one person. And so I think generally speaking, he hadn't been seen as the person, he hadn't been gotten a lot of blame for that. So prior to COVID hitting, people felt like the economy was doing pretty well under him. And so even for all their concerns about other things that Trump was doing during his first term, his views of his handling of the economy were strong. And so coming off of, late in Biden's presidency, a feeling that inflation had run amok, that cost of living was out of control, and Trump having been viewed as a good steward of the economy during his first term, I think that was a strong iron in his bag in terms of make a golfing analogy, which seems appropriate for President Trump, who loves golf. He was in a position to hit a really good shot with that, and he did. He won over a lot of voters who were primarily concerned about the economy, a lot of voters who were less engaged with politics, but what were they particularly engaged with? The state of affairs, state of the economy. And this was something he won people over with. Well, his approval of his handling of the economy has dropped. Economic sentiment is negative. People are worried about things, don't feel like things are getting better. So I don't think it's a coincidence that you can see sort of across whatever group you're looking at, a broad decline in Trump's approval. It doesn't necessarily mean it's been a huge one. Trump's a very polarizing figure, but there is a pretty notable decline, at least to some extent, among every group.
All right, last question I want to ask you about the generic ballot. The average you have now has Democrats plus 3.7. What does that mean for the Congress and congressional elections that are going to be happening in November? I think the people think that the Democrats have a good shot taking the House. What does that mean for the House and also, for the Senate, which would be a little bit more of a stretch for Democrats, but certainly some seats in play?
Right. So Republicans trail by about 4 percentage points in our generic polling average overall over the last, essentially since around the same time you saw Trump's approval take a more kind of a clearer decline from, that mid 40s to 42, 43% range. At around that same time in November, you saw Democrats gain a bigger lead in the generic ballot polling average, jumping up to 6, even 7 points on a few days. It's mostly been between about 4 and 6 over the last couple months in terms of their lead. And I think that is indicative of a Democratic leaning political environment. If you just sort of think about back in the napkin math, President Trump carried the national popular vote by about 1.5 points in 2024. You have polling showing Democrats up by 4-5 points. That would, suggest a swing toward Democrats of roughly 5-6 percentage points, and which would seemingly be the kind of environment that Democrats need in order to potentially take back the U.S. House. I'd say at this point, and it would seem the conventional wisdom is that they are favored, at least to some extent, to take back the House. If you go kind of seat by seat, it's a little. I think you do have Democrats favored, but there's still a lot up in the air. The Senate, Republicans are still favored. But I do think that the big question is sort of where does it trend from here, of course. And I think historically what you find is that the party that is out of power does tend to gain on this measure. I think a big question for Republicans as we move forward and looking at this average, like right now they're at about 41% in support. And that bounces around, different polls. Some are registered voters, some are likely voters. At this early point, a lot of polls are not polling or not releasing data for likely voters because it's hard to know who a likely voter is necessarily in February versus November or October into the fall. But nonetheless, the question is, do Republicans sort of continue to be in that low 40s territory, and do Democrats start to gain as we see more and more polls sort of getting more people who have made up their minds, have decided what they're going to do, or say they do prefer one side or the other, because pollsters, it's sort of a combination of people getting off the fence because they're starting to pay more attention as we get closer to the election. And also pollsters are releasing more likely voter numbers, which is to say they are filtering out people who are unlikely to vote. And in terms of the numbers they're releasing. And so you get fewer and fewer people saying they're undecided as a combination of these two things. And what we have often seen, is that the party that is in power, they sometimes don't gain a lot of ground from the point they're at this point, while the other party is gaining some ground. And thus, the margin for the party out of power tends to grow. Remains to be seen if that'll happen this time. We obviously have a long way to go until November, but it is obviously a concern for Republicans. And I do think while this is more helpful for understanding what's going on in the House, because the House is an actual national election of sorts, all 435 seats are up, whereas only about a third of the Senate is up every 2 years. So, because of the staggered 6-year terms in the Senate. At the same time, if Democrats do get a bigger lead on the generic ballot, and I don't think this lead is big enough for them to win the U.S. Senate in November, but if they were to have a bigger lead, that would be another sign of sort of sentiment favoring Democrats and maybe putting some red-leaning states that they essentially have to win. A state like Ohio, for instance, is one that might be a must win, or a state like perhaps Alaska is one where Democrats need to compete to have a chance of winning back the Senate. These states that are clearly red-leaning, they're not necessarily dark red, but they have a clear Republican lean. I think you need the environment to get even better for Democrats for those seats to actually be in danger for Republicans.
All right. Lots for us to continue to follow, but for now, let's leave it at that. Geoffrey Skelley, always great having your insight. Thank you.
Hey, thanks for having me.